Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The engine died with a sputtering cough that echoed across the empty Montana highway. I coasted my pickup to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires as Highway 287 stretched endlessly in both directions. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m, and I was still 40 miles from home after a brutal 16-hour shift at the Billings construction site. My name is Ethan Cross, and I've been building things with my hands for the better part of 15 years. Strong back, steady hands, and a mind that could solve most problems with a wrench and some elbow grease. Growing up in Kalispell, I learned early that when something breaks, you fix it yourself. My father ran a small contracting business, and I spent my summers working alongside him, learning that honest work with your hands was something to be proud of. By the time I graduated high school, I could frame a house, run electrical, and handle plumbing with the best of them. But what happened to me that Friday night in October was something no amount of practical knowledge could have prepared me for. I've been working on a new office complex in Billings for the past 3 months. The project was behind schedule, which meant longer days and weekend shifts. My crew chief, Rex, had been pushing us hard to make up time before the first snowfall. We poured concrete in temperatures that were barely above freezing, and my back ached from hauling rebar in the bitter wind that swept down from the mountains. The drive home should have been routine. I'd made this trip dozens of times, usually with talk radio, keeping me company, or an old country music station playing songs that reminded me of better times. But tonight the radio had been nothing but static since I'd left the city limits. Even the CB radio that I kept for emergencies was picking up nothing but white noise. I popped the hood and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the engine bay. Everything looked normal. No obvious leaks, no loose belts, no signs of overheating. I checked the battery connections, tapped the starter with my wrench, and tried to diagnose what had gone wrong. The engine was only 3 years old, well maintained, and had never given me a day of trouble. That's when I noticed the silence, not the normal quiet of a rural night, but something deeper and more unsettling. The insects had stopped chirping. The wind that had been howling across the plains all day had died completely. Even the distant sound of semi-trucks on the interstate had vanished. I straightened up from the engine bay and looked around, that primitive part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive, sending up warning flares. The temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air, and frost was already beginning to form on the hoods of my truck. This was wrong. The weather report had called for a mild night with temperatures in the low 50s, but now it felt like it was approaching freezing, and the cold was getting worse by the minute. I looked up at the sky to check for storm clouds and felt my knees go weak. The stars were wrong. I've lived in Montana my whole life. I know these skies like most people know their own backyard. My grandfather used to take me camping up in Glacier National Park, teaching me the constellations and how to navigate by the North Star. I could find Orion's belt on the darkest night, point out the Big Dipper to anyone who asked, and use Polaris to find true north without a compass. But the constellations above me were moving, shifting position like someone was slowly stirring a bowl of light. Orion was sliding sideways across the sky, and the Big Dipper was rotating in a way that defied everything I knew about astronomy. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe the stress of the long day was playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd hit my head when I was working under the hood. Then I saw the light. It started as a faint glow on the horizon, like the first hint of dawn, but it was coming from the wrong direction, and it was growing brighter by the second. The light had an odd quality to it, not the warm yellow of sunlight or the cold white of a spotlight, but something in between that made my eyes water and my head ache. As the glow intensified, I realized it wasn't coming from the horizon at all. It was coming from directly above me, growing larger and more defined as whatever was producing it descended through the atmosphere. I looked up to see what was blocking the moonlight and felt my knees go weak. Something massive hung in the sky above me, so large that it blotted out half the stars. The craft, and there was no other word for what I was seeing, was roughly triangular but with curves that hurt to follow with my eyes. Its surface didn't reflect light in any normal way. Instead, it seemed to absorb the starlight around it, creating a patch of darkness against the night sky that was somehow darker than the darkness around it. The ship made no sound as it descended, moving with the slow inevitability of a setting sun. There were no visible engines, no exhaust, no heat distortion that might indicate propulsion. It simply hung there, defying gravity and everything I understood about physics, growing larger as it approached the ground. I ran. My boots pounded against the asphalt as I sprinted down the highway, abandoning my truck and everything in it. Behind me, I could feel the presence of the craft like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. The air around me began to shimmer with a blue energy that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. With each step, my movements became slower, more laboured, as if I was running through invisible molasses. The asphalt beneath my feet began to glow with the same blue light, and I could feel myself being lifted despite my desperate attempts to keep running. My boots left the ground first, then my whole body was suspended in mid-air, rising slowly toward the craft that hung motionless above the highway. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the smell. Sharp and metallic, like copper pennies heated over a flame, mixed with something organic and wrong that made my stomach turn and my vision blur. There was also a sound barely audible, but felt more than heard, like a tuning fork struck inside my skull. I woke up strapped to a table in what could only be described as a medical facility designed by someone who had never seen human anatomy. The restraints weren't metal or plastic, but something that felt alive, warm to the touch and slightly yielding. They appeared to grow directly from the surface beneath me, seamless and unbreakable despite my best efforts to work them loose. The walls pulsed with a sickly yellow light that hurt to look at directly, shifting in intensity, like a slow heartbeat. The air was thick and humid, tasting like I was breathing through a mouthful of coins, mixed with something that reminded me of rotting vegetation. Every breath was an effort, and I could feel my lungs working harder than they should have to extract oxygen from whatever atmosphere they were providing. The ceiling above me was covered in what looked like veins or arteries pulsing with fluids of different colours, some glowing, some dark as oil. The organic tubes snaked across the surface and disappeared into the walls, creating a network that seemed to extend throughout the entire structure. This wasn't just a ship. It was alive in some way that made my skin crawl. Turning my head as far as the restraints would allow, I saw them, 12 other human beings in various states of consciousness, all secured to similar tables arranged in a rough circle around the chamber. To my left, a middle-aged businessman in a wrinkled suit was unconsciously tugging at his restraints, his face slack with whatever they had drugged him with. His name tag, somehow still attached to his jacket, read Ben Patterson, Regional Sales Manager. Beyond him, a teenage girl with purple streaks in her hair lay perfectly still, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at something on the ceiling that I couldn't see. Tears were running down her cheeks, but she made no sound. Her lips moved silently, and I could just make out the shape of words. "Mum" and "help me," repeated over and over. An elderly man with kind eyes and a carefully maintained beard was whispering what sounded like prayers, his voice so low I could barely hear him. Despite his obvious fear, there was a dignity to him that reminded me of my grandfather. He wore a university sweatshirt that identified him as faculty from the University of Montana. Across from me, a young woman in her 30s was struggling against her restraints with desperate energy. Her clothes were torn, and there were scratches on her arms that looked self-inflicted. She kept calling out for someone named Emma, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Where's my daughter?" she cried. "What did you do with Emma?" There were others. A construction worker whose hard hat lay on the floor beside his table. A woman in medical scrubs who must have been coming off a late shift. A teenager who couldn't have been more than 14. And several others whose faces I couldn't see clearly in the shifting light. The sound started as a low clicking, like beetles walking across glass. It grew louder, more complex, developing rhythms and patterns that seemed to bypass my ears and drill directly into my brain. The noise was accompanied by a smell that made my stomach lurch, something like sulfur mixed with ozone, and an underlying sweetness that was somehow worse than either. When they emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chamber, I understood why evolution had given us the instinct to fear the dark. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that bent in too many places and ended in hands that had too many fingers. Their skin was the colour of old pewter, mottled with darker patches that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The surface of their skin had a texture like wet leather, glistening slightly in the yellow light as if it was always damp. But it was their eyes that nearly broke my sanity. Black wells that seemed to pull light into them, surrounded by faces that were almost human, but wrong in every subtle detail. Their heads were elongated, tapering to a point at the back, with pronounced ridges where eyebrows should have been. They had no visible ears, just slight depressions on the sides of their skulls. And their mouths were too wide, filled with teeth that were sharp and numerous. They moved with a fluid grace that was hypnotic and terrifying, their joints bending in ways that human anatomy couldn't accommodate. When they walked, their feet made no sound on the organic floor, and they seemed to glide rather than step. The clicking sounds they made came from their throats, but also from somewhere deeper, as if their entire respiratory system was involved in communication. One of them approached Ben, the businessman, carrying what looked like a medical tray filled with instruments that defied description. The tools seemed to be part organic and part mechanical, twitching and writhing as if they were alive. Some had multiple appendages that moved independently, others pulsed with their own internal light, and a few seemed to exist in a state between solid and liquid. When the creature began its work on Ben, I learned just how thoroughly they had studied human anatomy. The procedure they performed was surgical in its precision, but alien in its purpose. They inserted probes through his skin that seemed to map his nervous system, drawing glowing lines of light beneath his flesh that traced the path of every nerve and blood vessel. Ben's screams echoed off the walls until his voice gave out, but the creature continued its methodical exploration, seemingly oblivious to his suffering. It extracted samples of tissue, bone marrow, and spinal fluid, storing each in containers that pulsed with their own bioluminescent glow. The worst part was the creature's clinical detachment. It showed no more emotion than a scientist studying bacteria under a microscope. They moved to the girl next. "Luna," she whispered, when she saw them coming, a voice barely audible. She couldn't have been more than 16, with the kind of defiant attitude that came from growing up too fast in a world that hadn't been kind to her. But when they pressed their needle-thin probes against her skull, the sounds she made weren't quite human anymore. The instruments they used on her were different, designed to access her brain directly. They drilled tiny holes through her skull with tools that seemed to cauterize as they cut, preventing bleeding but causing agony that no anesthetic could touch. I watched them extract something that glowed with its own pale light from behind her left ear. and her body went rigid as if electrical current was running through it. The elderly professor, Tobias, was next. Despite his age, he fought them with surprising strength, his academic mind trying to understand what they were doing, even as they tortured him. "Neurological mapping," he gasped, between screams. "They're studying our neural pathways, trying to understand how our brains work." The creatures seemed intrigued by his attempts at communication. They paused in their work, clicking amongst themselves in what might have been discussion. One of them placed a hand on Tobias's forehead, and his eyes rolled back in his head as if he was experiencing some kind of telepathic contact. When it was over, he was unconscious but breathing, and they moved on to their next subject, without finishing whatever they had planned for him. The young mother, Iris, fought them with the desperate fury of someone protecting her child, even though her daughter wasn't there. "Emma!" she screamed. "You can't have her. She's only 8 years old." The creatures paid no attention to her pleas, working with the same clinical efficiency they had shown with the others. Then they came for me. The restraints released with a soft hiss, but before I could move, two of the creatures grabbed my arms with fingers that felt like steel cables wrapped in cold rubber. Their grip was impossibly strong, and their skin was warm and slightly moist, like touching a fever patient. They dragged me to a different table, one equipped with instruments that defied description and hurt to look at directly. The new table was different from the others, more complex, with appendages that moved independently and surfaces that shifted to accommodate my body. As they positioned me on it, tendrils emerged from the table itself, wrapping around my limbs and torso with the fluid motion of living things. The restraints were organic, growing tighter as I struggled against them. As they positioned the first device near my chest, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the sound of Luna whimpering in the background, or the sight of Ben's unconscious form, covered in strange markings, or just the accumulated terror and rage of the past hour. Whatever it was, it overrode the paralytic fear that had kept me docile. 15 years of construction work had given me muscles that could swing a 20-pound sledgehammer for 8 hours straight. I'd lifted steel beams, poured concrete, and worked in conditions that would break most people. When I drove my elbow into the creature's midsection with all the force I could muster, it folded in half with a sound like breaking glass, mixed with tearing fabric. The impact felt wrong. The creature's body was both harder and softer than human anatomy, with internal structures that didn't match anything I understood. My elbow connected with something that felt like cartilage wrapped around metal, and dark fluid began pouring from the wound. The instrument it had been holding shattered against the floor, releasing a cloud of gas that glowed green and smelled like burning plastic. The fluid pooling around the fragments wasn't blood, in any sense I recognized. It was too dark, too thick, and it seemed to move with its own purpose, flowing uphill and forming patterns that hurt to look at. The remaining creature made a noise like tearing metal mixed with a bird's scream and produced what could only be a weapon. The device was organic in appearance, looking more grown than manufactured, with surfaces that rippled and pulsed. Energy crackled between its multiple appendages as it pointed the weapon at my head, but before it could fire, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not electronic, but organic, like the death cry of some massive creature amplified 1,000 times. Red lights joined the yellow, creating a nauseating strobe effect that made the whole chamber feel like it was spinning. The walls themselves seemed to convulse, and the organic tubes overhead pulsed faster, carrying fluids at an increased rate. The creatures exchanged rapid, clicking sounds that conveyed obvious panic. Their usual graceful movements became jerky and agitated, and the wounded one I had struck was making a continuous keening sound that sent chills down my spine. Whatever was happening, it wasn't part of their plan. and their distress was palpable. More creatures appeared from hidden openings in the walls, moving with urgent purpose. They completely ignored us human captives, focused entirely on whatever crisis was unfolding. The air filled with their clicking communication, a cacophony of alien voices that rose and fell in waves of what sounded like increasingly desperate coordination. Finally, a group of them turned their attention back to us. Without ceremony or explanation, they began releasing the restraints that held us to the tables. Luna collapsed immediately, her legs unable to support her weight after whatever they had done to her nervous system. Ben was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Tobias was awake but disoriented, his eyes unfocused and his hands shaking. They dragged all of us, the conscious and unconscious alike, through corridors that seemed to be alive. The walls weren't just metal or plastic. They were veined with organic tubes that pulsed with fluid, some glowing, others dark as oil. The floor beneath our feet felt warm and slightly yielding, like walking on skin stretched over muscle. In some places, the walls were transparent, revealing chambers filled with strange organisms, floating in luminescent fluid. The corridors were vast, stretching farther than seemed possible for even a ship of the size I had seen from outside. We passed chambers filled with incomprehensible machinery that seemed part biological and part technological. In one room, I glimpsed thousands of containers filled with specimens from what must have been dozens of different worlds. Another chamber held what looked like a garden, but the plants were unlike anything that had ever grown on Earth. Crystalline structures that rang like bells when the air currents touched them. The creatures moved us through this maze with increasing urgency, their clicking communications growing more frantic by the minute. Some of them were clearly injured or ill, moving with obvious pain and leaving trails of that dark fluid behind them. Whatever crisis had triggered the alarms was getting worse, and they needed us elsewhere for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. We emerged into a chamber so vast that the far walls disappeared into darkness. The ceiling was lost in shadows above us, and the scale of the space was overwhelming. It felt like being inside a cathedral, if cathedrals were built by beings who understood architecture in dimensions that human minds couldn't quite grasp. At the center of this vast space lay something that made the other creatures look almost normal by comparison. It was massive, easily 20 feet long, and perhaps 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to shift between different configurations as I watched. The creature was connected to the ship through hundreds of biomechanical tubes that fed into its body at regular intervals, creating a web of connections that pulsed with various colored fluids. This was clearly their leader, and it was dying. The creature's skin was pale and translucent in places, revealing internal organs that pulsed weakly with diminishing light. Its breathing was labored and irregular, and with each exhale the lights throughout the chamber dimmed slightly. The biomechanical connections that sustained it were working harder, pumping fluids faster, but whatever they were providing wasn't enough. The other creatures clustered around their leader, their clicking sounds taking on a desperate, pleading quality that needed no translation. Some of them were touching the great creature's skin with their elongated fingers, and I could sense rather than see some kind of communication passing between them. The emotional weight in the chamber was crushing. Fear, grief, and a desperate hope that felt like drowning. That's when one of them spoke to me, not with words, but with thoughts forced directly into my mind. The mental contact felt like having ice water poured into my skull, and the alien emotions that came with it, fear, desperation, and something that might have been grief, nearly overwhelmed my own consciousness. The communication wasn't language in any sense I could understand. Instead, images and concepts flooded my mind, showing me their history in a series of overwhelming visions. I saw their homeworld, a place of purple skies and silver seas, with cities that grew like coral formations and technology that was indistinguishable from living tissue. I witnessed the first appearance of the plague that was destroying them, a pathogen that attacked their neural systems, causing their advanced minds to shut down in cascading failures. I felt their horror as entire cities fell silent, their greatest thinkers and leaders dying in agony as their own intelligence turned against them. The images showed me the desperate measures they had taken as the plague spread. They had evacuated entire planets, searching for ways to stop the contagion. They had sacrificed their own people, in experiments that made what they had done to us seem gentle by comparison. They had travelled for centuries, following every lead, chasing every possibility that might offer salvation for their dying species. Their research had eventually led them to Earth, to the discovery that human biology contained something their more advanced immune systems lacked. Our crude, primitive defences against disease included mechanisms that could neutralise the pathogen that was killing them, but the resistance wasn't something that could be synthesized or replicated. It had to be taken from living human neural tissue and integrated directly into their own biology. The bargain they offered was simple: help save their leader, and we would all be returned to Earth unharmed. Refuse, and we would become permanent research subjects until they found another solution, or until their leader died, and their ship's biological systems failed, stranding all of us in the void between stars. I looked around at the other captives, all of whom seemed to be receiving the same telepathic communication. Ben was awake now, his face pale with terror as alien thoughts invaded his mind. Luna was curled in a fetal position, sobbing quietly as she experienced visions of worlds dying. Iris was screaming for her daughter, convinced that the images of destruction were somehow connected to Emma's fate. Tobias, despite his academic training, was struggling to process what he was seeing. "This is impossible," he kept muttering. "The scale of it, the implications for biology, for evolution." But even as he tried to apply scientific reasoning to what we were experiencing, I could see the understanding dawning in his eyes. These things had tortured us, experimented on us, treated us like laboratory animals, without regard for our suffering or dignity. Every rational part of my mind screamed that trusting them was suicide. They had given us no reason to believe they would honour any agreement, and their track record suggested they viewed us as nothing more than disposable resources. But I also saw something else in their leaders' fading consciousness, the weight of responsibility for an entire species. Through the mental link, I caught glimpses of nurseries filled with young that would never reach maturity, of knowledge accumulated over millennia that would die with their civilization, of art and culture and achievement that made human civilization look like children playing with blocks. The creature communicating with me wasn't just asking for help, it was begging. Despite their technological superiority, despite their ability to cross interstellar space and manipulate matter at the molecular level, they were helpless against this plague. They were facing extinction, and we represented their last hope. "If I help you," I said aloud, not sure if they could understand English, but knowing that they could sense my intent, "through the telepathic link, you release some of them first. Proof of good faith." The lead creature, somehow I could distinguish it from the others now, perhaps through subtle differences in the telepathic contact, considered this request. Its black eyes reflected depths I couldn't fathom, and I could feel it consulting with others of its kind through channels I couldn't access. The discussion seemed to involve the entire crew, a rapid exchange of thoughts and concepts that left me dizzy. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, it gestured to two of its companions. They approached Luna and Tobias, the gentle professor who had tried to comfort the rest of us during our ordeal. The organic restraints that had been holding them dissolved like melting ice, and both humans collapsed to the organic floor. Luna was in bad shape. Whatever they had done to her brain had left her with severe neurological damage. She couldn't stand without support, and her pupils were dilated to different sizes. But she was alive, and when Tobias helped her to her feet, she managed a weak smile that was the first sign of hope I'd seen since waking up on that table. "No more experiments on the others," I continued, my voice stronger now that I'd seen they were capable of keeping their word. "Whatever you need, you take from me. Everyone else goes free, healthy, and unharmed." "The process will likely kill you," Tobias said, his voice shaking as he translated more of what he was receiving through the telepathic link. "Ethan, you can't do this. There has to be another way." But there wasn't, and we all knew it. I could see it in Luna's haunted eyes, in the way Iris clutched at the empty space where her child should have been, in Ben's broken whimpering as he relived whatever horrors they had subjected him to. These creatures had the power to keep us here forever, to continue their experiments until we were all dead or broken beyond repair. Our only hope of freedom lay in saving the very being that had authorized our torture, and the irony of that wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to show mercy to creatures that had shown us none, to sacrifice myself for beings that had treated us like laboratory animals. But as I looked at the other captives, Luna struggling to stand, Ben curled up in trauma, Iris calling out for her missing daughter, I realized that the choice wasn't really about forgiveness or justice. It was about survival, both theirs and ours, and sometimes survival requires making deals with devils. "Do it," I said. They moved quickly once the decision was made, with an efficiency that spoke of desperate urgency. I was taken to a surgical platform that rose from the floor like a living thing, its surface conforming to my body as I lay down. The platform was warm and slightly yielding, and I could feel it making minute adjustments to support my weight and position me optimally for whatever they planned to do. The creatures worked with instruments that seemed to be part technology and part organism, tools that moved with their own volition and seemed to anticipate their users' needs. Some of the devices were clearly surgical, cutting tools with edges that glowed with heat, suction devices that removed fluids, clamps that sealed blood vessels. Others were beyond my comprehension, objects that seemed to exist in more dimensions than I could perceive. The procedure began with a series of injections that numbed my body, but left my mind achingly clear. I could feel them cutting into my skull with precision that no human surgeon could match, but the pain was distant and manageable. The real agony came when they began connecting neural pathways from my spinal cord to their leader's brain stem. It wasn't just physical pain, though that was considerable. It was the sensation of having my very self invaded and altered, of foreign thoughts and memories forcing their way into my consciousness. As the connections deepened, I began to experience flashes of alien memory that were overwhelming in their scope and intensity. I saw the birth of their civilization on a world so different from Earth that I had no frame of reference for understanding it. Their sun was a binary star system casting purple and orange light across landscapes of crystalline formations and metallic vegetation. Their ancestors had evolved not from mammals or reptiles, but from something that combined aspects of both, while being fundamentally different from either. Their society had developed along lines that human civilization had never considered. They had no concept of individual ownership because their telepathic abilities made privacy impossible. They had never developed religions because their science had answered questions about existence and meaning that humans could only guess at. They had achieved interstellar travel, not through rocket propulsion, but by learning to manipulate the fundamental forces that held matter together. But with all their advancement, they had also developed a terrible vulnerability. Their minds were so interconnected, so dependent on the collective consciousness of their species, that a pathogen that attacked neural tissue could spread through their entire civilization like wildfire. The plague had started on a single world and spread through their telepathic network faster than any quarantine could contain it. I experienced their horror as entire planets fell silent, billions of minds linked in their final moments of agony before the connections went dark forever. I felt the weight of decision after decision as their leaders chose increasingly desperate measures to save their people. I understood the terrible calculus that had led them to Earth, to the realization that primitive species like humanity might hold the key to their survival. But something else was happening during the procedure. As my human neural patterns merged with the alien leader's consciousness, I found myself in a battle for control that neither of us had expected. The creature's mind was vast and ancient, filled with knowledge that spanned millennia and experiences that covered multiple star systems. But it was also weakened by disease and desperation, its usual mental defenses compromised by the very plague we were trying to fight. My smaller, more focused human consciousness became a lifeline, not just providing immunity to the plague, but offering something the aliens had lost in their technological advancement. Human minds, crude as they might seem by alien standards, had evolved in an environment of constant struggle and adaptation. We had developed mental resilience through facing threats that could destroy us, learning to function even when hope seemed lost. For what felt like hours, I fought to maintain my identity while allowing the alien access to my biological defenses. The process was like being caught in a telepathic storm, with thoughts and memories from both our species swirling together in patterns that defied comprehension. I experienced the aliens' memories of watching entire worlds die, felt its crushing responsibility for the survival of its species, and understood the terrible weight of decisions that could doom or save billions of lives. But I also forced it to experience human emotions, love for family and friends, hope in the face of impossible odds, and the irrational determination to survive that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars. I showed it Luna's defiance, even in the face of torture, Tobias's intellectual curiosity, even while being experimented upon, and Iris's love for her daughter that transcended any personal fear. The alien consciousness recoiled from these emotions at first, finding them chaotic and difficult to process. Their species had evolved beyond such primitive responses, they believed, developing more efficient ways of thinking and feeling that didn't waste energy on irrational impulses. But as the procedure continued, I felt something change in the aliens' perception. It began to understand that what they saw as primitive chaos was actually a source of strength. Human emotions weren't just random neural firings, they were survival mechanisms that had been tested by millions of years of evolution. Our ability to feel love made us willing to sacrifice for others. Our capacity for hope allowed us to keep fighting even when logic said we should give up. Our irrational stubbornness had carried us through extinctions that should have wiped us out. As this understanding grew, the aliens' resistance to the procedure began to break down. Instead of fighting my neural patterns, it started to integrate them, allowing my immune responses to merge with its own biology, while accepting the emotional content that came with them. The process became less of a battle and more of a collaboration, two different forms of consciousness working together toward a common goal. The physical integration was successful beyond what either species could have hoped for. The human antibodies and immune responses that I provided began neutralizing the pathogen in the alien leader's system, while the advanced alien biology enhanced and amplified my natural defenses. But the mental integration was even more profound. We had created something new, a hybrid consciousness that combined human resilience with alien knowledge. Through our shared awareness, I could feel the plague beginning to retreat throughout the ship. Other crew members who had been showing early symptoms of infection were stabilizing as the leader's improved condition somehow boosted their own immune systems. The ship's biological systems, which had been failing as their leader weakened, began to function normally again. but the procedure had changed both of us in ways that couldn't be undone. I could now sense the emotions and intentions of every creature on the ship, feeling their relief and gratitude as their leader recovered. The alien leader, meanwhile, had acquired something its species had never possessed: the ability to understand and appreciate the chaotic beauty of human emotion. The recovery period was unlike anything I had ever experienced. My consciousness existed simultaneously in my own human brain and in the alien neural network that now partially housed it. I could access memories and knowledge that belonged to their species, understanding concepts that human science wouldn't discover for centuries. At the same time, the alien leader was experiencing human sensations and emotions for the first time, learning what it meant to feel fear and hope and love as individual experiences rather than collective ones. The other human captives were cared for during this time with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to their earlier treatment. The aliens had learned something from their connection with me, that the creatures they had been experimenting on weren't just biological specimens, but conscious beings with their own thoughts, feelings, and intrinsic value. Luna's neurological damage was repaired using techniques that went far beyond human medical knowledge. The aliens rebuilt her damaged neural pathways with a precision that left her not just healed, but somehow enhanced, her mind sharper and more focused than it had been before her injury. Ben's psychological trauma was addressed through careful manipulation of his brain chemistry, removing the worst of the terror while leaving his memories intact but manageable. Tobias, fascinated despite everything he had endured, spent hours in telepathic communication with the ship's scientific crew. His knowledge of Earth biology proved invaluable in helping them understand how to synthesize the immune responses they needed without requiring further human subjects. The old professor's excitement at being able to contribute to science on such a scale was infectious, and even some of the aliens seemed to appreciate his enthusiasm. Iris was reunited with her daughter Emma, who had never actually been taken. The child had been safe at home with a babysitter while her mother was abducted, but the aliens' memory manipulation had made Iris believe otherwise. The reunion was tearful and joyful, a reminder of the human bonds that the aliens were only beginning to understand. The return journey was a blur of preparation and adjustment. The aliens, true to their word, began preparing for our release. They had learned to synthesize the necessary biological components from my neural tissue samples, eliminating their need for further human subjects. The process they developed was elegant in its simplicity. They could now produce the immune factors they needed without causing harm to any sentient being. But the decision to return us to Earth wasn't made lightly. Through my connection with their leader, I participated in discussions that involved the entire crew and representatives from other ships in their fleet. The question wasn't just whether to honor their agreement with us, but whether contact between our species should continue in some form. Some of the aliens argued for limited, careful contact that might benefit both civilizations. Humans could provide biological diversity and emotional resilience that their species lacked, while they could offer knowledge and technology that could advance human civilization by thousands of years. Others worried that contact would inevitably lead to conflict, pointing out that human history was filled with examples of more advanced civilizations destroying less developed ones. In the end, they chose isolation. Not out of fear or hostility, but out of a kind of respect that I hadn't expected from beings who had tortured us just days before. They had learned through our connection that humanity needed to develop at its own pace, to face its own challenges and make its own discoveries. Premature contact with an advanced alien civilization could stunt human growth, or, worse, lead to our species becoming dependent on alien technology rather than developing our own capabilities. The other captives were cleaned, their wounds treated with technology that left no scars, and their memories carefully edited to protect both our species from the knowledge of what had occurred. The process wasn't crude brainwashing, but something far more sophisticated. They removed the traumatic elements while leaving enough memory to explain the time gap, creating false but believable experiences that would satisfy any investigation. Ben would remember his car breaking down and spending several days in a small town hospital after a minor accident. Luna would believe she had run away from home for a few days before returning on her own. Iris would recall taking Emma on an impromptu camping trip that had gone longer than planned. Each story was crafted to fit their personalities and circumstances, woven into their memories with such skill that they would pass any psychological examination. Only I retained full memory of what had happened, partly because of my neural connection with their leader, and partly because someone needed to remember. The alien consciousness that now shared space in my mind explained that knowledge of their existence needed to be preserved, even if it could never be shared. Someday, when humanity was ready, that knowledge might prove crucial. The process of returning us to Earth was as carefully orchestrated as our original abduction. The ship approached our planet during a new moon, using technologies that rendered it invisible to our primitive detection systems. They had studied our communication networks and transportation patterns, identifying the optimal times and locations to return each of us without arousing suspicion. I was the last to be released, and the farewell was more complex than I had expected. Through the neural link, I exchanged final communications with the alien leader, a being whose thoughts would forever be part of my own consciousness. There was gratitude, certainly, but also something that might have been friendship. The recognition of two very different minds that had found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. Your species will face many challenges in the centuries ahead, the alien leader communicated. Wars, plagues, environmental disasters, and questions about your place in the universe. But you have something we lost long ago. The ability to hope when hope seems impossible. To love in the face of hatred. To choose mercy over vengeance. These are not weaknesses, as we once believed, but the greatest strengths any species can possess. I wanted to ask about their plans. About whether they would survive as a species. About what the future held for both our civilizations. But the neural connection was already fading as they prepared me for return. The last thing I sensed from the alien consciousness was a feeling of peace, not just relief at their survival, but a deeper satisfaction at having learned something valuable about the nature of consciousness itself. I woke up slumped over the steering wheel of my pickup truck on Highway 287. The dashboard clock read 3:23 a.m. Monday morning. Somehow 3 days had passed. My engine started on the first try, purring like it had just been tuned by the world's best mechanic. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to reconcile the impossible memories that felt more real than the familiar landscape around me. The physical evidence was minimal but undeniable. Strange scars crisscrossed my scalp, hidden beneath my hair but tender to the touch. They formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a map of neural pathways etched into my skin. My body bore other marks that looked like surgical incisions but felt different, too precise, too clean, as if made by instruments that didn't exist on Earth. I knew instinctively that I could never show these marks to a doctor, could never tell anyone what had really happened. The knowledge sat in my mind like a lead weight, isolated and impossible to share. When friends and co-workers asked about my weekend, I found myself telling them I'd been sick with food poisoning, a lie that came easily and felt more believable than any version of the truth. But the most profound change was the connection that remained. Sometimes, usually late at night when the world was quiet and my defenses were down, I could sense them out there among the stars. The alien ship had left Earth's solar system, but the neural link we had forged transcended distance in ways that human science couldn't explain. Through that connection, I learned that the alien leader had not just survived, but thrived. The hybrid immune system we had created together had proved more effective than either species could have achieved alone. The plague that had threatened their civilization was not just contained, but eliminated, and they had developed treatments that could cure others of their kind who had been infected. More importantly, the emotional resonance they had gained through our connection had begun to spread through their species. They were learning to value individual consciousness alongside collective thought, to appreciate the chaotic beauty of emotional experience rather than seeing it as an inefficiency to be corrected. Their art, their science, their entire culture was evolving in directions they had never considered before. The other abductees had been returned to their lives with carefully constructed amnesia, but I sometimes wondered if they shared my dreams. Ben went back to his corporate job in Denver, but co-workers noticed that he seemed more compassionate, more willing to listen to others' problems and offer help. Luna returned to high school in Seattle with improved grades and a newfound interest in astronomy that she couldn't quite explain. Iris was reunited with her daughter Emma, who had indeed been safe at home the entire time, but Iris found herself holding her daughter closer, appreciating their time together with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the camping trip she remembered taking. Tobias returned to his retirement but found himself writing papers on theoretical biology that were years ahead of current scientific thinking, insights that seemed to come from nowhere, but felt absolutely correct. None of them showed any signs of remembering their actual experiences, but they all seemed changed in subtle ways, more empathetic, more aware of the fragility and preciousness of life, more open to possibilities they had never considered before. Perhaps some residue of the alien contact had survived the memory editing, or perhaps the experience of facing the impossible had awakened something in them that couldn't be erased. 6 months passed, then a year, then 2. I continued working construction, still swinging a hammer and solving problems with my hands. But I found myself taking on different projects: hospitals, schools, community centres, places where the work felt more meaningful than just putting up another office building or shopping mall. My crew noticed the change, commenting that I seemed to have developed an almost supernatural ability to understand what a building needed to serve its purpose. The truth was that my enhanced perception, a side effect of the neural integration, allowed me to see structures in ways that purely human senses couldn't. I could sense stress patterns in materials before they became visible, anticipate how people would move through spaces, and design solutions that felt intuitively right, even when I couldn't explain why. It was a gift I used carefully, never pushing the boundaries so far that anyone would ask uncomfortable questions. But it was the nights that truly belonged to the connection I had forged among the stars. Lying in bed in my small house outside Kalispell, I would close my eyes and let my consciousness drift beyond Earth's atmosphere. The journey was not physical but mental, following pathways carved by alien technology into the fabric of space itself. Through these journeys, I learned that the aliens had kept their word about ending human abductions. The synthesized immune factors were working perfectly, and they no longer needed biological samples from our species. But more than that, they had developed a respect for humanity that influenced their interactions with other primitive civilizations they encountered, where once they might have simply taken what they needed from less advanced species, they now approached such situations with the kind of consideration they had learned from our connection. They had become teachers and protectors rather than exploiters, sharing knowledge and resources with developing civilizations while being careful not to interfere with natural development. I also learned that they were not the only alien civilization traveling among the stars. The universe was vast and full of life, from species that were barely more advanced than humanity to beings so evolved that they existed as pure consciousness without physical form. Most of these civilizations were benevolent, but not all, and conflicts between starfaring species were not uncommon. Through my connection with the alien leader, I became aware of a vast and complex galactic community that humanity was not yet ready to join. There were trading networks that spanned multiple star systems, scientific collaborations that involved dozens of species, and cultural exchanges that produced art and literature beyond human comprehension. There were also wars fought with weapons that could sterilize entire worlds, plagues that jumped between species, and philosophical conflicts that had raged for millennia. Earth, it seemed, existed in a kind of protective bubble, not isolated by accident, but deliberately shielded by more advanced civilizations who recognized our potential and wanted us to develop naturally. Humanity was seen as a young species with great promise, but one that needed time to mature before making contact with the broader galactic community. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. To know that we were not alone in the universe was wonderful, but to understand how primitive and vulnerable we were in comparison to what was out there was humbling. Through the alien memories I could access, I saw civilizations that had achieved things humanity couldn't even dream of. Cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Beings that could manipulate matter at the atomic level with their thoughts. Species that had learned to transfer consciousness between bodies as easily as changing clothes. But I also saw that advancement didn't necessarily mean happiness or fulfillment. Many of the most technologically sophisticated species had lost something essential in their development: the capacity for surprise, for growth, for the kind of chaotic creativity that came from facing genuine challenges. They had solved all their problems, and in doing so, had eliminated the struggles that gave life meaning. This was why the aliens I had encountered valued their connection with humanity so highly. We represented something they had lost: the ability to face uncertainty with hope, rather than despair, to find joy in simple pleasures, to form bonds of love and loyalty that transcended logic. Our primitive emotional responses, which they had once seen as inefficiencies, were actually sources of strength that their advanced civilization couldn't replicate. Through our neural link, the alien leaders often shared observations about human behavior that it found fascinating. The way we created art, not for any practical purpose, but simply for the joy of creation. The way we formed friendships and romantic relationships that served no evolutionary advantage but brought meaning to our lives. The way we could find hope in the darkest circumstances and beauty in the most unlikely places. These insights were gradually changing alien society in ways that rippled through their entire civilization. They were rediscovering concepts like individual privacy, personal achievement, and emotional expression that they had abandoned in their pursuit of collective efficiency. Their art, which had become sterile and mathematical, began to incorporate elements of chaos and spontaneity that produced works of startling beauty and originality. Their science, too, was being revolutionized by human-inspired approaches to problem-solving. Where they had always relied on logical analysis and systematic methodology, they began experimenting with intuition, creativity, and the kind of inspired leaps that had characterized human scientific breakthroughs. The results were discoveries that had eluded them for centuries, insights that came not from careful calculation but from the willingness to consider impossible possibilities. But perhaps the most significant change was in how they viewed other species. The harsh utilitarianism that had led them to abduct and experiment on humans was being replaced by a genuine respect for the consciousness and dignity of all sentient beings. They began to see diversity of thought and experience as valuable resources rather than inconvenient variables, and their interactions with other civilizations became collaborative rather than exploitative. 3 years after my abduction, I began to notice that I was aging differently. Not dramatically. I still looked like a man in his 30s, but there were subtle changes that suggested the alien technology had altered my biology in fundamental ways. My reflexes were sharper, my endurance greater, and my resistance to illness and injury had increased significantly. I healed from cuts and bruises faster than normal, and I seemed to need less sleep while maintaining higher energy levels. More concerning were the mental changes. My memory had become nearly perfect, able to recall conversations word for word and visualize complex technical drawings after seeing them only once. My spatial reasoning had improved to the point where I could design architectural solutions in my head that would have required computer modeling before. I was becoming something more than human, and I wasn't sure what that meant for my future. The alien consciousness that shared my mind assured me that these changes were beneficial, part of an evolutionary leap that would eventually benefit all of humanity. Through our connection, seeds of alien knowledge were being planted in human consciousness, preparing our species for the eventual contact that would come when we were ready. I was not the only one. Other humans around the world were experiencing similar subtle enhancements, the result of various alien encounters that had been carefully orchestrated to introduce beneficial changes without causing cultural shock. But knowing that my transformation was part of a larger plan didn't make it easier to live with. I was becoming increasingly isolated from normal human experience, able to see patterns and possibilities that others couldn't perceive. My relationship suffered as I found it harder to relate to people whose consciousness remained purely human. I dated occasionally, but, how could I explain to someone that I shared my mind with an alien intelligence from across the galaxy? Work became my refuge, the one place where I could use my enhanced abilities in ways that felt productive and meaningful. I started my own construction company, specializing in projects that required innovative solutions to complex problems. My reputation grew as word spread about the contractor who could visualize structural solutions that other engineers missed, who could predict and prevent problems before they occurred, who built things that lasted longer and worked better than anyone expected. But even success felt hollow when you couldn't share the real source of your achievements. I was like a man who had learned to see color, trying to describe rainbows to people who lived in a black and white world. The knowledge and abilities I had gained were incredible gifts, but they came with a loneliness that was almost unbearable. It was during my 4th year post-abduction that I made a discovery that changed everything. While working late one night on plans for a new hospital, I felt the familiar tingle that indicated incoming contact through the alien neural link. But this time the communication wasn't coming from the ship that had abducted me. It was coming from Earth. Another human being was reaching out through the alien communication network, someone who had undergone a similar experience and retained similar memories. The contact was brief and tentative, like someone calling out in the dark and hoping for an answer. But it was unmistakably human consciousness enhanced by alien technology, reaching across thousands of miles to make contact with someone who might understand their situation. Over the following weeks, I learned to use the neural network more deliberately, sending out my own tentative signals and listening for responses. Gradually, I made contact with others like myself, humans who had been taken, altered and returned with enhanced abilities and impossible memories. We formed a loose network of communication, sharing experiences and supporting each other through the challenges of our altered existence. There was Dr. Patricia Wells, a neurosurgeon in Boston, who had been abducted 2 years earlier and now possessed an almost supernatural understanding of brain anatomy. She was revolutionizing surgical techniques by incorporating insights gained from alien medical technology, saving lives that would have been lost with conventional treatment. Marcus Thompson, a former Marine living in Arizona, had gained enhanced physical abilities and tactical awareness that he was using to train search and rescue teams. His success rate in finding missing persons was so high that he was becoming something of a legend in law enforcement circles, though he could never explain the source of his abilities. Jennifer Kim, an artist in San Francisco, had developed the ability to perceive and create in color spectrums that normal human vision couldn't detect. Her paintings were causing sensations in the art world, with critics struggling to explain how she achieved effects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. There were others. A teacher in Vermont who could intuitively understand the learning patterns of any student. A farmer in Iowa whose crops grew with impossible vigor and resistance to disease. A musician in Nashville who could compose symphonies that seemed to resonate with frequencies that touched the human soul in ways that traditional music couldn't achieve. All of us had been changed by our encounters with alien intelligence, and all of us were using our enhanced abilities to benefit humanity in various ways. We were like seeds planted in human consciousness, preparing our species for transformations that were still decades or centuries in the future. But we were also pioneers, living proof that the boundary between human and alien consciousness was more flexible than anyone had imagined. Through our network, I learned that the alien civilizations were not just passively observing human development. They were actively working to prepare us for eventual contact, introducing beneficial changes at a rate that wouldn't cause cultural shock or technological disruption. The abductions, the experiments, the careful modifications, they were all part of a long-term plan to guide human evolution in directions that would benefit both our species and the galactic community we would eventually join. But the timeline was longer than any of us had imagined. Full contact between humanity and alien civilizations was still at least a century away, possibly longer. Until then, those of us who had been enhanced would serve as bridges between worlds, using our hybrid abilities to advance human knowledge and prepare the ground for revelations that would reshape our understanding of existence itself. The loneliness didn't disappear entirely, but it became manageable now that I knew I wasn't alone. Through the network, I found people who understood the weight of impossible knowledge, who shared the burden of abilities that couldn't be explained, who lived with the daily awareness of how small and vulnerable humanity was in the vast cosmos around us. We developed our own support systems, our own ways of sharing information and coordinating efforts to benefit human civilization. We became a secret society of human-alien hybrids, working behind the scenes to guide our species toward a future we could see but couldn't directly reveal. 5 years after my abduction, I stood on the porch of my house in the mountains of Montana, looking up at a sky filled with stars that I now knew harbored countless civilizations. My enhanced vision could pick out details in the night sky that normal human eyes would miss. The subtle variations in stellar radiation that indicated the presence of artificial structures, the faint traces of exotic matter that marked the passage of interstellar vessels, the complex patterns of energy that showed where advanced civilizations had learned to harness the power of entire star systems. But what struck me most was not the evidence of alien intelligence, but the beauty of it all. The universe was not a cold, empty void, but a vast garden teeming with life and consciousness and possibilities that human imagination had barely begun to explore. Every star was potentially home to beings with their own hopes and dreams and struggles, their own art and science and philosophy, their own ways of understanding the mystery of existence. Through my connection with alien consciousness, I had learned that the universe was not just alive but actively creative, constantly bringing forth new forms of intelligence and awareness. Humanity was not an accident or an anomaly, but part of a vast evolutionary process that was gradually awakening the cosmos to consciousness of itself. We were young and primitive by galactic standards, but we were also precious, representatives of a phase of development that more advanced civilizations remembered with nostalgia and longing. Our emotional intensity, our creative chaos, our stubborn refusal to accept limitations, these were gifts that we would eventually share with the broader universe, enriching the galactic community in ways that we couldn't yet imagine. The scars on my scalp had faded over time, becoming almost invisible except to my enhanced tactile sensitivity, but the neural pathways they represented had grown stronger, creating permanent connections to consciousness that spanned the galaxy. Through those connections, I remained in contact with the alien leader whose life I had helped to save, a being who had become something like a friend across the impossible gulf of species difference. Sometimes, in moments of deep meditation or profound quiet, I could sense its presence among the stars. Older now, wiser but still carrying within its vast consciousness a small kernel of human emotion that served as a reminder of the time when two impossible different minds had merged to create something new. It was studying our species with the patience of geological time, watching our development with the kind of protective attention that a gardener might give to a particularly promising seedling. The future stretched ahead of us like an unwritten book, full of possibilities that no single consciousness could encompass. There would be challenges, environmental crises, technological disruptions, social upheavals that would test our species' ability to grow and adapt, but there would also be discoveries and achievements that would transform our understanding of what it meant to be human. And someday, when we were ready, we would take our place among the stars, not as conquerors or supplicants, but as partners in the vast collaborative effort to awaken consciousness throughout the universe. We would bring our unique gifts, our capacity for hope, our talent for finding beauty in chaos, our ability to form bonds of love and loyalty that transcended logic, and receive in return knowledge and perspectives that would expand our awareness beyond anything we could currently imagine. Until that day came, those of us who had been touched by alien consciousness would continue our quiet work, building bridges between worlds and preparing humanity for revelations that would change everything. We were living proof that the impossible was possible, that consciousness could transcend the boundaries of biology and culture and species, that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to dream. I survived an alien abduction, and it was a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. But it was also the beginning of the most incredible adventure in the history of human consciousness, a journey toward understanding our place in a cosmos that was vast beyond comprehension, but also intimate beyond belief, a universe where every conscious being was connected to every other in ways that made us all part of a single, vast, evolving mind that was slowly awakening to its own infinite potential. The stars still called to me, as they always would, but now I understood that the call was not from somewhere else, but from within, the voice of consciousness itself, inviting me to join in the eternal dance of awareness that connected all things across space and time and the seemingly impossible distances between one mind and another. And in that dance I had found not just survival but purpose, not just existence but meaning, not just life but the promise of something far greater than any single being could achieve alone.